Hi everybody, my name is Rick. Welcome to my Idaho cabin. Today I'm going to show you how to make Argentine chimichurri bread. This is one of my favorite breads because it's so flavorful. It makes excellent toast and sandwiches. There are 2 or 3 ways to make bread, as you probably know. You can make it by hand. You can use like a KitchenAid with a dough hook, or in my case, I like to do a hybrid method where I use a bread machine to mix the dough, and then I use a bread pan and an oven to cook it. So today, I'll be showing you how I do it. With a bread machine, I like to put the wet ingredients in first. So the first ingredient is 1 cup of warm water, about 100 degrees, something like that. Next, 1½ tablespoons of white vinegar. Next, 3 tablespoons of olive oil. ½ teaspoon of cayenne pepper. One teaspoon of Mexican oregano, 2 cloves of garlic, finely minced, 3 tablespoons of finely minced onion, three tablespoons of parsley, one and a half teaspoons of salt, three tablespoons of wheat bran, and 3 cups of bread flour. Finally, we'll add 2½ teaspoons of yeast, regular yeast. By the way, keep your yeast in the freezer to keep it fresh. Just a little tip. Now that all the ingredients are in the container for the bread machine, put the container in the bread machine and turn the machine on the dough cycle. Turn it on. That's all there is to it. The bread machine is now kneading the dough. It will do the first rise also. The only thing we need to do is to make sure that the consistency of the dough is correct. That is the correct water to flour ratio. We'll do that in a minute as soon as the machine makes it into a ball, and then we can feel the ball for tackiness. As you can see, the machine is kneading the bread. Once a ball forms, you want to reach in and touch the ball and see how tacky it is. This one's a little tacky, so I'm going to add a little bit more flour to the bowl. Once the initial knead is done, the machine will fully knead it. A little bit more flour. That feels about right. Okay, so we'll let the machine do its work. Prior to baking the bread, we need to prepare the pan. What I like to do is to take some cooking spray and just spray the pan lightly. Add some flour and shake it around. This will coat all the edges and will give you a nice no-stick pan. Okay, that ought to do it. There we go, a nicely coated pan. The next step in the baking process after forming a loaf is to let the bread do a second rise. To do that, I put it in a warm oven for about an hour. Now, the oven I have here, the light inside is not quite warm enough to provide sufficient warmth. So what I've done is I've made an extension cord with a light bulb at the end. And I put that in the oven to provide just a little bit additional heat so that the oven will be just the right temperature to cause the bread to rise properly. For those of you who've made bread before, you know that after the first rise and punch down, the dough acts like an unruly child. And like an unruly child, you need to send it to its room for about 15 minutes. After it sits in the room for about 15 minutes, the dough will behave itself so you can form it into a loaf properly. Well, the unruly child has been in its room for about 15 minutes, so now it's time to form it into a loaf. So now we'll take the dough out of the bread machine pan and put it on a floured board. Now we form it into a loaf. Now it's kind of manageable, and it isn't really springing back like it will if you don't let it rest. That's about right. There's our bread ready to go. We have one more step to do before we can put the bread in the oven. We need to cover it. I've found an easy way to do that is to take some plastic wrap and spray it with non-cooked spray. That's so when we remove the plastic, the bread doesn't stick to it. Okay, nicely covered. Okay, the bread is ready to go into the oven. We'll put that right in here. Now we'll let the bread sit in the oven for about an hour to do a second rise. Now that is one good looking loaf of bread. Let's get the cover off. There you go. Take the light out and button her up. Sounds like those springs need to be oiled a little bit. So now we'll start this loaf of bread at 325 and we'll bake it for 35 minutes. And starting it from a cold start allows it just to puff up at the last second and become a really full loaf of bread. Well, the timer is telling me that the bread is just about ready, so let's give it a check. Boy, if that doesn't look good. How about that? If it tastes half as good as it smells in here, we're going to be in for a treat. Okay, now what I'm going to do is turn this out on a wire rack to cool. But first I'm going to take its temperature to make sure it's done. You can check a loaf by tapping it. If it sounds hollow, it should be done. But just to be safe, we'll take its temperature, 195, 196, it's done. Now we'll let that cool for about 10-15 minutes, and just might cut a slice off one end just to make sure that it tastes good. You have to do a quality control check after all. Well, here's the taste test. If fresh baked bread isn't the best thing in the world, I don't know what is. Thank you for watching another episode of My Idaho Cabin. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please check on the subscribe button down below and like it. Again, this is Rick, and thank you for watching My Idaho Cabin.